My brother stole Dad's will and tried to claim everything for himself, so I waited patiently, then revealed the truth when it hurt him most. I'm a 33-year-old guy, and my dad was the kind of man who built everything from scratch. He wasn't rich, but he was proud of the small hardware store he started in our town. Proud of his calloused hands, and proud that his two sons could one day carry his name forward. I grew up watching him fix everything, not just broken tools, but broken days. If the roof leaked, he'd climb up and fix it before dinner. If I looked sad, he'd hand me a wrench and say, "Work with your hands, son. It'll clear your mind." Those mornings with him were everything. The smell of sawdust, the hum of old radio songs, the comfort of shared silence. That was our language, not fancy words, just respect. Then there was Ethan, my older brother. The golden one? He had Dad's smile, but none of his grit. He was always chasing something bigger. Business ventures, city parties, investments that never paid off. He'd breeze into town once every few months, flash his expensive watch. He'd hug Dad like a politician, shaking hands, and then leave with a few $100s to get by. Never complained. Someone had to keep the shop running. Someone had to stay. And Dad trusted me with that responsibility like it was sacred. But lately, I'd noticed something changing in him. His movements slower, his coughs lasting longer. The way he'd sometimes stare at the old photo of Mom and whisper, "Guess I'm getting tired too." Ethan didn't notice, or maybe he didn't care. He just called once in a while, talking about future plans. And one evening, as I watched Dad struggle to close the shop's front shutter, a cold thought crept into my mind. What would happen to everything when he was gone? I didn't know it then, but that question would tear our family apart. Dad's decline started quietly. A slower walk here, a deeper cough there. At first, I brushed it off as age. He'd always been strong, the kind of man who never saw doctors because he believed rest and tea could fix anything. But one evening, as I handed him a box of nails, his hands trembled so badly that the metal spilled across the counter like falling rain. "Maybe it's time you see someone," I said gently. He smiled faintly. "Doctors cost money, son, and you know I've got work to finish." That night, I stayed awake listening to his cough echo through the thin walls. The next morning, I made the appointment myself. The results came back a week later, and they hit like a freight train. Stage 4. Nothing they could do but manage the pain. From then on, every day felt heavier. I closed the shop early, cooked his meals, made sure he took his medicine. Ethan called twice, promising to visit, but never did. "I'm dealing with investors," he'd say, his voice brisk. "You've got this, right?" One afternoon, Dad asked me to sit by his bed. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I've made arrangements," he said. "The lawyer's got everything. It's fair split the way it should be. Don't let money change who you are." I nodded, fighting the lump in my throat. "I won't, Dad. I promise." I smiled weakly. "Good. Ethan means well. He's just lost in his own world." I didn't argue, though we both knew Ethan's world was built on lies and charm. 2 weeks later, Dad passed in his sleep. His hand was still clutching mine. It's calloused and warm. And when Ethan finally arrived, sunglasses on, phone in hand, his first words weren't, "How are you holding up?" They were, "So, what did Dad leave behind?" That was the moment something inside me cracked. The day of the funeral was gray, the kind of sky that looks like it's holding its breath. I barely slept the night before, replaying every word Dad ever said. The church was full. Neighbors, old friends, even suppliers who'd known him for decades. Everyone came to honor the man who'd helped them fix something at one point or another. Ethan showed up late, of course. Slick suit, polished shoes, and that same rehearsed half-smile. He hugged me briefly, his cologne too sharp, his voice too light. "You did good, man. Everything looks respectable." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. During the eulogy, he sat up front like the perfect son, head bowed just enough to look heartfelt. But when people came to pay respects, he was the one shaking hands, accepting condolences like the spotlight was his. After the service, we stood outside as people left. Aunt Linda said softly, "Your father would be proud. Ethan, carrying on his legacy. Ethan smiled. Yeah, I'm planning to keep the business running. That was always his wish. I froze. That's not what Dad said. I remembered his words clearly, split the way it should be. Later, as we loaded the last of the flowers into my truck, I said quietly, Ethan, the lawyer has Dad's will. We'll go through it properly. He waved me off. Yeah. About that, I already talked to him. Seems like the will got misplaced or something. But I know what Dad wanted. Stared at him, the air suddenly too thin. Misplaced? How? He shrugged, smiling like it was nothing. Does it matter? We can handle this ourselves, brother to brother. That word brother sounded poisonous on his tongue. For the first time in my life, I realized Ethan wasn't just selfish. He was dangerous. The next morning, I drove straight to Dad's lawyer's office. The old man looked uneasy when he saw me. I was expecting both of you, he said, glancing toward the empty chair where Ethan should have been. He said the will was misplaced, I replied. My voice tight, the lawyer sighed, rubbing his temples. That's partially true. The signed copy isn't here. It was in this drawer. He opened it empty. But I swear it was filed right after your father's final visit. Right. My stomach twisted. Could someone have taken it? He hesitated. The last person who came asking about it was your brother. Said your father wanted him to double-check something. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the polished wood of his desk, hearing my heartbeat in my ears. Ethan had stolen it. I didn't need proof. I felt it. That evening I went to Dad's house, now technically Ethan's, since he'd already started calling it that. He was in the living room, sipping whiskey. The smell of expensive cologne filling the space that once smelled like coffee and engine oil. Ethan, I said. Keeping my voice steady, you talked to the lawyer. He smirked. Yeah, poor guy's getting old. Probably misplaced the file. These things happen. It's funny how it disappeared right after you visited him. His eyes flicked toward me, cold, unbothered. You think I need to steal anything? Dad wanted me to take charge. He knew I could handle things better than you. I felt my chest tighten. That's not true, Ethan. He wanted things to be fair. He leaned forward, voice low and deliberate. Fair. Life's not fair, little brother. Maybe it's time you learned that. I left before I said something I'd regret. But my hands were shaking on the steering wheel all the way home. Because deep down, I already knew he wasn't just erasing Dad's will. He was erasing me from everything Dad had built, and for the first time, realized I'd have to fight for my father's legacy alone. Over the next few weeks, Ethan moved fast, too fast. He transferred the shop's accounts into his name, told suppliers he was streamlining operations, and even changed the business signage from Harrison Sons Hardware to Ethan's Hardware Solutions. Seeing that new sign felt like a punch to the gut. The word Sons, the one that meant us, was gone. I tried to talk to him once more. Ethan, this isn't what Dad wanted, I said, standing in the empty shop where our father's old hammer still hung on the wall. He didn't even look up from his phone. Dad wanted someone competent to keep it running. You can't even balance a spreadsheet. You're selling the place out piece by piece. You're not keeping it. You're gutting it, he smirked. Maybe that's what it needs. Times have changed. You wouldn't understand? Every word chipped away at me. I wanted to yell, to throw something, but I could hear Dad's voice in my head. Don't fight fire with fire. Be patient. Truth always surfaces. So I stayed quiet. I started noticing the little things Ethan overlooked, receipts he left behind, old emails from the lawyer, his carelessness when he got drunk. While he played the role of the successful heir, I was collecting fragments of the truth he thought he'd buried at night. I'd sit in Dad's old office, surrounded by dust and silence, going through files no one else cared about. Every faded document felt like a whisper from him, urging me to keep looking. Ethan thought he'd won, that I'd given up. But I wasn't beaten. I was just waiting. And deep down, I knew the day would come when all his lies would start to crack. One night, I was sorting through Dad's old desk, the one Ethan said he'd already cleared out, smelled faintly of motor oil and sawdust, the scent of my childhood. I ran my fingers along the drawers, expecting nothing but old receipts and tools. Then I felt a loose panel at the back. When I pried it open, A small black USB drive slid out and hit the floor. It was labeled in Dad's handwriting for my sons. My heart started pounding. I plugged it into my laptop, the screen lighting up with folders, photos, scanned documents, and one PDF titled Final Will. When I opened it, my breath caught. It was Dad's real will, signed, dated, and witnessed. Clear as day, it stated that the business, the house, and remaining savings were to be split evenly between Ethan and me. But there was more. Attached was a financial record proof that Dad had already loaned Ethan nearly $60,000 over the past few years, something he'd never mentioned. The will even noted that amount should be deducted from Ethan's share. I stared at the screen, shaking. Ethan hadn't just lied, he'd stolen. For a long time, I sat there in silence, the weight of it pressing down on me. Every insult, every manipulation suddenly made sense. But instead of storming over to his house, I heard Dad's voice again. Be patient, son. Truth doesn't need to be shouted, so I made copies of everything. One on a flash drive, one sent to my lawyer, and another stored online. Then I leaned back in the chair, staring at Dad's name on that document. For the first time since his death, I smiled, not because justice had been served yet, but because now. It could be Ethan thought he'd buried the truth, but he'd forgotten who taught me to dig. Over the next few months, Ethan transformed himself into the town's new success story. Billboards featured his smug grin with the tagline, "Family owned since 1988. He hosted charity dinners, gave interviews about carrying his father's dream forward, and paraded around like a hero. Watching it all felt surreal, like he'd stolen not just the business, but Dad's identity too. Everywhere I went, people congratulated him. Your brother's doing great things, they'd say. I'd force a smile and nod, pretending not to taste the bitterness in my mouth. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know he'd built his empire on ashes and lies. Sometimes, I'd catch glimpses of him around town, stepping out of his new car, designer clothes, expensive watch, glinting in the sun. He looked untouchable. But underneath that shine, I could see it. The same arrogance that had always been his weakness. The more he gained, the sloppier he became. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet, deliberately invisible. I worked a part-time repair job, saved money, and met with my lawyer in secret. We built our case piece by piece, organizing every document from the USB, every receipt, every fake transaction Ethan had made. I wanted it to be airtight, bulletproof. One evening, my lawyer leaned back and said, "When we move once. No warnings, no leaks. You'll get one shot. Make it count." And I knew exactly how to make it count. Ethan lived for attention. Public image was his currency. If I was going to take him down, it had to be in front of the same crowd that worshipped him. So I waited, silently watching him climb higher, knowing every step brought him closer to the fall, because the higher he rose, the harder he'd crash when the truth finally hit, the day Ethan finally showed his true colors to everyone. Wasn't a grand betrayal. It was quiet, humiliating, and deeply personal. I showed up at the old workshop, the one Dad and I had built with our own hands, just to grab a few things I'd left behind. The smell of oil and rust hit me as soon as I opened the door. It still felt like home. Even though everything inside screamed his ownership now, but Ethan was already there. He stood in the middle of the shop, talking to a realtor. When he saw me, he grinned. "Perfect timing," he said. "You can help me clear your junk out. The place is going on the market." "You're selling Dad's workshop?" He shrugged casually. "It's just an old shed, man. I've got investors interested in a new office space. Sentimental, doesn't pay bills." "That's not yours to sell," I snapped, the words trembling in my throat. He stepped closer, his tone sharp. "Everything here is mine. The house, the shop, the business, all of it. You had your chance, little brother. You chose to stay small." The realtor avoided eye contact as I stood there, realizing the depth of his greed. He wasn't just taking money. He was erasing Dad and me piece by piece. I left before my anger turned into something worse. That night, I parked my car near the shop and just sat there, staring at the flickering streetlight reflecting off the windows. I had nowhere to go. The man who called himself my brother had taken everything, and the people around me still believed he was the good son. For the first time in my life, I felt utterly defeated, like I'd failed Dad's memory. But as the night deepened, one thought began to burn through the despair like a spark through dry wood. Ethan thinks he's untouchable, but he has no idea how close his reckoning really is. After that night, something inside me shifted. The pain didn't fade, it hardened. I stopped trying to reason, stopped waiting for Ethan to find a conscience he never had. It was time to act. My lawyer and I met regularly, away from town, in a small cafe where no one would recognize us. We went through every detail of the case, the digital copies of the will, the timestamps proving authenticity, and the records of Ethan's forged signatures. Turns out, he hadn't just stolen from me. He'd forged Dad's name to access joint accounts after his death. It wasn't just inheritance theft anymore. It was fraud. We started building a legal trap, one Ethan couldn't wriggle out of even with his charm. The lawyer's words echoed in my mind. When we strike, make sure it hurts in the one place he values most, his reputation. Ethan announced a legacy gala, an event celebrating his success and the supposed values our father had passed down. It would be filled with family, business partners, press, and old neighbors. The irony was almost poetic. I began preparing quietly. I confirmed with the lawyer that the documents were validated and backed up in multiple places. I contacted the family's old accountant, who agreed to testify if needed. Every piece of the puzzle slid perfectly into place. Ethan, meanwhile, had no idea. He even called me for the first time in months and said, "You should come to the event, man. Maybe it's time to bury the hatchet." I almost laughed at the choice of words. "I'll be there," I told him, because he was right about one thing. Something was about to be buried that night, but it wouldn't be the hatchet. It would be his lies. The night of the gala was everything Ethan had dreamed of: chandeliers, photographers, champagne glasses clinking. The venue was packed with townsfolk and investors who saw him as the visionary son continuing our father's work. His name was printed on banners in gold letters. Mine wasn't mentioned anywhere. I stood near the back, unnoticed, blending into the crowd. Watching him laugh, shake hands, and give speeches made my blood simmer. He wore Dad's old watch, the one I'd given him permission to borrow for the funeral, never to see again. When the music softened and the lights dimmed, Ethan took the stage. His voice boomed through the hall. My father taught me everything: loyalty, integrity, and legacy. Tonight, I dedicate this success to him. Polite applause filled the room, but I could feel the bile in my throat. When the MC asked if anyone wanted to say a few words, I stepped forward. Ethan froze for a second before forcing a smile. "Everyone, this is my brother," he said. "The man behind the scenes." I took the mic, steadying my breath. Dad did teach us about legacy, but he also taught us something else. Truth always surfaces. A murmur spread through the audience. I nodded toward the projector screen behind Ethan. My lawyer, sitting quietly in the corner, pressed a button on his laptop. The lights flickered, and the screen filled with the image of Dad's real will, his signature clear, his wishes undeniable. Gasps erupted. Ethan's face went white. Then came the attached documents, records of his loans, the proof of forged transactions, even the timeline showing when the will was stolen. I turned to him. "You said Dad wanted you to have it all." "Funny this says otherwise," he stammered, voice cracking. "This is fake," but the lawyer stood, raising a certified copy. "Authenticated. Court approved." The silence that followed was suffocating, and for the first time, Ethan had nowhere to hide. The room erupted in whispers, the kind that sting worse than shouts. Ethan's perfect image shattered in seconds. I watched the color drain from his face as investors and family members turned away. His voice cracked when he tried to speak. This isn't what it looks like." But it was exactly what it looked like. The lawyer calmly handed out copies of the documents, each stamped and verified. One of the journalists in the crowd snapped a photo of the screen. The headline practically wrote itself. "Ethan Harris, The town's golden son, exposed as a fraud, he stormed off the stage, but the damage was irreversible. People followed him, demanding answers. His so-called friends disappeared one by one, their fake smiles gone. I just stood there, watching the chaos unfold, not out of joy, but out of relief. For the first time since Dad died, the truth was louder than Ethan's lies. Within a week, legal papers were filed. The court froze his accounts pending investigation into forgery and inheritance fraud. The business ownership was suspended until the case resolved. Ethan tried calling me once, twice, then a dozen times. I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. Instead, I drove to the cemetery with a copy of Dad's will in my pocket. I knelt beside his grave and whispered, "I did what you asked. Dad, I waited. I didn't fight dirty. I just told the truth." The breeze moved through the trees, gentle and calm. Like his silent approval, Ethan had built his empire on deception. And it collapsed faster than he ever imagined. And standing there, under the fading sunset, I finally understood justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. And this time, the whisper was enough to destroy him. Months passed before the noise finally died down. The court ruled in my favor. Half the estate, half the business, everything my father intended. Ethan lost nearly everything, including the investors who once called him visionary. The store returned to its original name, Harris & Sons Hardware, the way it was meant to be. I repainted the old sign myself, brushing each letter slowly, like a quiet act of reclaiming my father's legacy. People in town started treating me differently. Some apologized for believing Ethan's lies. Others simply nodded in quiet respect. But I didn't need their validation. I just wanted peace and maybe a chance to rebuild what my father had dreamed of. Ethan eventually reached out. His message was short. "I messed up. I'm sorry." I stared at it for a long time before replying, "Dad wanted us to be honest men. You still have time to learn that." I hit send and blocked his number. Some wounds didn't need to be reopened. Now mornings feel lighter. I open the shop at sunrise, the smell of wood and metal filling the air again. Dad's old radio still plays static-filled country songs, and sometimes when the light hits the counter just right, I swear I can see him, sleeves rolled up. Smile, small but proud. I keep his words close. Truth always surfaces. It took years, and it cost me nearly everything, but he was right. The truth didn't need my rage, it needed my patience. One evening, as I locked up the store, I looked at the sign again, Harris & Sons. Not perfect, not shiny, but honest. I smiled softly, whispering into the quiet air, "You were right, Dad. I didn't have to fight. I just had to wait." And this time, waiting gave me everything he wanted me to have: peace, pride, and closure.